When you picture a Viking, what comes to mind? Probably a fierce, bearded warrior, maybe a little rough around the edges, covered in the dirt and grime of battle. For centuries, this has been the popular image, one of savage, unwashed barbarians. But what if I told you that this picture is almost completely wrong? What if I told you that, in their time, Vikings were considered some of the cleanest, most well-groomed people in Europe? It sounds unbelievable, right? Well, today, we're going to dive deep into the fascinating, and frankly, very surprising world of Viking hygiene. Get ready to have your perceptions shattered as we uncover the truth behind the myth. The stereotype of the dirty Viking largely comes from their enemies, particularly the English and the French. To them, the Vikings were pagan invaders, a disruptive force. It was easy to paint them as uncivilized brutes, and what's more uncivilized than being dirty? But archaeological evidence and historical accounts tell a completely different story. Excavations of Viking settlements have unearthed a treasure trove of personal grooming tools. We're talking about combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and even razors. These weren't just simple, functional items. Many were beautifully crafted from bone, antler, or metal, often with intricate carvings. This suggests that personal grooming wasn't just a chore. It was an important part of their daily routine and cultural identity. A Viking wouldn't leave home without their comb. It was as essential as their axe or knife. Let's talk about those combs for a second. They are one of the most common artifacts found in Viking graves, for both men and women. This tells us that keeping their hair and beards neat was incredibly important. The combs were often stored in their own protective cases, showing how much they were valued. For men, a well-kept beard and long hair were signs of virility and status. They would braid them, sometimes weaving in beads or metal rings. For women, long flowing hair was a mark of beauty, and they took great care in washing, combing, and styling it. So, far from being tangled and matted, Viking hair was likely a point of pride, but it wasn't just about hair. An Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, who met a group of Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, gave us a very detailed, though not entirely flattering account. He noted that they washed their faces and heads every day. Now, his description of how they did it, is a bit stomach-turning for us. He describes them sharing a single bowl of water, with each person washing, spitting, and blowing their nose into it before passing it to the next. While this sounds pretty gross by our modern standards of germ theory, the key takeaway is this: they washed every single day. In an era when many Europeans might bathe only a few times a year, a daily wash was revolutionary. And it wasn't just a quick splash of water. The sagas, which are the epic stories of the Viking Age, are filled with references to bathing. They speak of hot baths, steam baths, and washing before meals and special occasions. Saturday in the Old Norse language was called lagerdagur, which literally means washing day or bath day. Tradition is so strong that the word for Saturday in modern Scandinavian languages, like lørdag in Swedish and lørdag in Danish and Norwegian, still comes from this ancient term. This weekly, dedicated bath day was a communal activity. The whole family or community would gather for a thorough scrub. They used soaps made from animal fat and ash, and they would often relax in steam rooms, similar to a modern sauna, throwing water on hot stones to create steam. This obsession with cleanliness actually gave them an unexpected advantage. An English writer from the 13th century, John of Wallingford, complained that the Viking men were a little too popular with the local Anglo-Saxon ladies. Why? Because, as he put it, they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes regularly. This made them far more attractive than the presumably less groomed English men. It seems the Vikings' good hygiene was a powerful tool, not just for health, but also for seduction. They were seen as clean, stylish, and desirable, which must have been quite frustrating for their rivals. So, we have these incredibly well-groomed individuals who are combing their hair, bathing weekly, and changing their clothes. They sound pretty clean, right? This is where the story gets complicated. While they were meticulous about their personal bodies, their living environments were a different story. Let's step inside a typical Viking longhouse. These were long, narrow buildings, often housing multiple families and sometimes even their livestock, all under one roof. There was a long fire pit running down the center for warmth and cooking, but there were no chimneys. Smoke would just fill the room and slowly seep out through a small hole in the roof. Imagine the constant smell of smoke, cooking food, unwashed animals, and dozens of people all packed into one poorly ventilated space. The air would have been thick and pungent. The floors were typically just packed earth. Any spilled food, animal waste, or general trash would just get trampled into the dirt. While they might occasionally lay down fresh rushes or straw on the floor, they weren't exactly sweeping and mopping every day. There was no concept of sanitation as we know it. Waste was often just thrown out the door, creating middens or trash heaps right next to the house. These would have been smelly and would have attracted all sorts of pests. Speaking of pests, analysis of soil from Viking settlements shows that they were absolutely teeming with parasites. Intestinal worms, lice, and fleas were a constant part of life. Despite their personal washing habits, they were living in an environment that was a breeding ground for disease. This is the great paradox of Viking hygiene. How could a people so concerned with their personal appearance live in such squalor? The answer lies in their understanding of the world. They didn't have germ theory. They didn't know that invisible microbes in their environment could make them sick. For them, cleanliness was about appearance, social standing, and ritual. It was about looking good, feeling good, and showing respect to others and to their gods. A clean body and neat hair were signs of a disciplined and respectable person. The state of the floor or the air quality in their house just wasn't part of that equation. Dirt was just dirt. It wasn't seen as a source of illness. So, the Vikings were both clean and dirty at the same time, depending on your perspective. They were personally hygienic to a degree that was remarkable for their time, putting many of their European contemporaries to shame. They were stylish, they were well-groomed, and they smelled a lot better than the stereotype suggests. But they lived in environments that, by our standards, were incredibly unsanitary. Their homes were smoky, crowded, and filled with parasites. It's a complex picture that defies simple labels. The next time you see a movie or a TV show depicting a grimy, filthy Viking, you can smile to yourself, knowing the truth is far more interesting. They weren't just barbarians. They were well-groomed paradoxes, the clean conquerors of a dirty world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the surprising world of Viking hygiene. If you found this as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. What other historical myths would you like us to bust? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. When archaeologists excavate the wells of Viking towns, they find objects that should never be in drinking water. At Hedeby, a well contained not just wooden buckets and the expected debris, but also human feces, animal bones, and the decomposing body of a dog. At Rib in Denmark, one of the oldest Viking trading towns, the wells show similar contamination. The water that people drew up to drink, to cook with, to wash their faces in the morning. This water was often polluted with the very waste they had dumped at the edges of town, seeping down through the soil and into the groundwater. The Vikings did not understand germ theory. They could not see bacteria or know that contaminated water spreads disease. What they knew was that people got sick, that children died with frightening regularity, that fevers and stomach ailments swept through towns like invisible spirits. They attributed these illnesses to fate, to the will of the gods, to curses and evil magic, never to the fundamental design of their towns. The bones of the dead tell us how high a price they paid for this ignorance. In the graveyards around Birka and Hedeby, archaeologists have examined thousands of skeletons. The story written in these bones is one of constant suffering. Malnutrition left its marks in the teeth and the growth lines of long bones. Parasitic infections, roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms riddled the intestines of rich and poor alike. The evidence of these parasites survives in the microscopic eggs found in the soil of latrines and in the guts of bodies preserved in peat bogs. One particularly well-preserved body, found in a bog in Denmark and dating to the Viking Age, showed signs of having been infected with multiple species of intestinal parasites simultaneously. This was normal. This was the baseline condition of life in a medieval town where people shared water sources with their waste, where they handled food with hands that had just emptied chamber pots, where the concept of sanitation, as we understand, it did not exist. Life expectancy in Viking towns was brutally short. A person who survived childhood itself, a major accomplishment, might hope to live into their 40s if they were lucky. Women faced particular dangers from childbirth, dying in labor at rates that would seem catastrophic today. Men died from injuries and infections that would now be easily treatable. The wealthy lived only marginally longer than the poor, because wealth could not protect you from contaminated water or the diseases that flourished in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Yet even as disease ravaged their towns, the Vikings possessed medical knowledge that was, in some ways, remarkably sophisticated. They understood wound care in ways that saved lives on the battlefield and in daily accidents. When a warrior was cut by a sword, Viking healers knew to clean the wound with water, sometimes with water that had been boiled, though they did not know why this worked better. They applied poultices made from herbs, yarrow to stop bleeding, plantain to prevent infection, honey as an antibacterial agent. Modern science has confirmed that many of these treatments were genuinely effective, that the compounds in these plants do possess healing properties. The Vikings also understood basic surgery. They could set broken bones, stitch up deep cuts, and even perform amputations when necessary. Archaeological evidence shows healed fractures that were properly aligned, suggesting skilled manipulation of broken limbs. Some skulls show signs of trepanation holes deliberately drilled into the skull, perhaps to relieve pressure from head injuries, and remarkably, some of these patients survived, the bone showing signs of healing around the edges of the hole. They had diagnostic techniques that seem almost modern in their logic. The leak test was used to determine if a stomach wound was fatal. A warrior who had been stabbed in the abdomen would be fed a soup made with onions or leeks. If the healer could smell these vegetables in the wound, it meant the stomach or intestines had been pierced, and the injury was almost certainly mortal. This was a crude but effective way of assessing internal damage without being able to see inside the body. But this medical knowledge existed side by side with practices that spread disease rather than preventing it. Healers did not wash their hands between patients. They had no concept of sterilizing their tools. A knife used to cut infected flesh might be wiped on a cloth and then used moments later to cut into another wound. The same poultices and bandages might be reused. If a healer had success with a particular treatment, they would continue using it even as they unknowingly spread infection from one patient to another. And beyond the realm of practical medicine lay the world of magic and ritual, which the Vikings did not separate from healing in the way we do now. A woman with a fever might be treated with herbs and cool water, but also with charms and incantations. A child who failed to thrive might be given medicinal foods, but also carried to a sacred grove where offerings would be made to the gods. The line between medicine and magic was not just blurred, it did not really exist. Illness was understood as having both physical and supernatural causes, and treatment had to address both. Some rituals served a hygienic purpose, even if the Vikings did not understand the mechanism. The practice of bathing on Saturdays, for example, was partly spiritual, a way of entering the sacred day of rest in a state of cleanliness. But it also meant that people regularly washed away the accumulated dirt and bacteria of the week. The custom of burning the belongings of the dead, common in early Viking Age burials, effectively sterilized items that might carry disease. The taboos around menstruating women, which required them to isolate themselves and avoid preparing food, may have originated from spiritual concerns, but also prevented the spread of infections during a time when women were particularly vulnerable. Yet for all these accidental benefits, the fundamental problem remained. Viking towns were designed in ways that guaranteed disease. The layout of these settlements created perfect conditions for epidemics. Houses were built close together, sharing walls, allowing illness to spread rapidly from one household to the next. Workshops where animal hides were processed involving blood, feces, and urine sat next to homes where families ate and slept. Butchers dumped offal into the same areas where children played. The very density that made these towns economically successful made them death traps from an epidemiological perspective. Summer was particularly deadly. In the warm months when the sun beat down on the accumulated waste, when flies bred in uncountable millions, on the refuse heaps when the stench became almost unbearable, even to people who had lived with it all their lives. This was when the fevers came. We can see evidence of this in the burial patterns, in the way certain graves cluster together in groups that suggest multiple deaths in a short period. These were likely outbreaks of diseases that thrive in unsanitary conditions: dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The towns also served as magnets for disease from the countryside. Traders brought more than goods from distant lands. They brought new illnesses to which the local population had no immunity. The same ships that carried silver and silk also carried rats, and those rats carried fleas, and those fleas carried plague. While the Great Black Death would not arrive until centuries after the Viking Age ended, smaller outbreaks of bubonic plague almost certainly occurred, sweeping through densely packed towns and leaving devastation in their wake. Children suffered most of all. Modern analysis of grave sites shows that infant and child mortality in Viking towns was catastrophically high. Perhaps a third of all children died before their first birthday. Of those who survived infancy, many more would die before reaching adulthood. Diarrheal diseases from contaminated water killed with frightening efficiency. Respiratory infections spread easily in the smoky, crowded interiors of Viking homes, where whole families slept together in a single room, where the fire in the center of the floor filled the air with smoke that had nowhere to go but through a hole in the roof. Mothers knew these dangers intimately. They could recite the names of children lost, could remember the fevers that came on suddenly, the coughs that would not stop, the wasting away that no amount of care could prevent. Every woman who reached old age had buried children. Every family had empty places at the table where sons and daughters once sat. Yet life continued, towns grew, trade flourished. Because for all the disease and death, Viking towns also offered something that could not be found in the isolated farmsteads scattered across the northern countryside: opportunity. Here a skilled craftsman could grow wealthy. Here a merchant could connect with trade networks that stretched from Dublin to Baghdad. Here a young person could escape the predetermined life of a farmer and make something new of themselves. The towns were Paradox's centers of culture and commerce, built on foundations of filth, places where people took pride in their appearance while living surrounded by waste, communities where sophisticated medical knowledge coexisted with practices that spread disease. And then, gradually, things began to change. The transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because the Vikings suddenly understood germs or sanitation. It happened because of Christianity. As Viking towns converted to Christianity in the late 10th and 11th centuries, new ideas about purity and pollution entered the culture. Christian monks and clergy, educated in the remnants of Roman hygiene practices, brought with them concepts of institutional cleanliness. Monasteries had rules about where waste should be disposed, about washing before meals, about keeping water sources separate from latrines. These ideas began to influence town planning. Wells were dug farther from refuse piles. Some towns began to establish designated areas for different types of waste. The most organized communities created rules enforced by local authorities about where butchers could work and where tanneries could operate. It was not systematic sanitation, not by modern standards, but it was an improvement over the earlier chaos. The church also introduced hospitals and almshouses, institutions where the sick could be isolated and cared for. While the medical care in these places was still primitive, the simple act of separating the very ill from the general population reduced the spread of contagious diseases. Monasteries cultivated herb gardens with medicinal plants and systematized knowledge about which treatments worked, creating an early form of pharmaceutical tradition. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Christianity introduced the idea that cleanliness was next to godliness. That filth was not just unpleasant, but spiritually corrupting. This gave people a new reason beyond mere vanity or the old Saturday bathing ritual to care about their environment. It created social pressure to maintain cleaner homes and streets, to view waste disposal as a moral issue rather than just a practical one. By the 12th century, the Great Viking Age was ending, and the towns were transforming into something new. They were becoming medieval Christian cities, still dirty by our standards, but notably cleaner than their pagan predecessors. Stone replaced wood in major buildings, reducing fire hazards and improving drainage. Cobblestone streets in the wealthiest areas kept feet out of the mud and made cleaning easier. Public fountains in town squares provided cleaner water than the old communal wells. The irony is that as these improvements were made, As infant mortality began to decline and life expectancy inched upward, a memory of what had come before began to fade. Later medieval writers, looking back at the pagan Viking period, often characterized it as a time of barbarism and filth, ignoring the complexity of Viking hygiene practices. They remembered the open sewers, but forgot the weekly baths. They noted the disease, but overlooked the medical knowledge. They created a simplified story of progress from darkness to light, from pagan filth to Christian cleanliness. The truth, as the archaeological record shows, was far more complicated. The Vikings were neither as dirty as their Christian critics claimed, nor as clean as some modern enthusiasts imagine. They were people caught between contradictory impulses, valuing personal grooming while tolerating public squalor, possessing medical knowledge while lacking basic sanitation, taking pride in their appearance while living in conditions that bred disease. What really happened to health and cleanliness in Viking towns was not a simple narrative of improvement or decline. It was a slow, uneven transformation driven by changing beliefs, accumulated knowledge, and the hard lessons learned from plague and epidemic. It was a story of human beings trying to build civilized communities without understanding the invisible world of bacteria and parasites that made their towns so deadly. When we excavate these sites today, when we sift through the layers of refuse and examine the bones of the dead, we are not just uncovering the past. We are discovering how fragile the line is between culture and disease, how much of what we call civilization depends on understanding things we cannot see. The Vikings built remarkable towns, mastered long-distance trade, created beautiful art and complex societies, but they could not defeat the enemies that lived in their water and their waste. Their story reminds us that human ingenuity has always been constrained by human ignorance, that our greatest achievements exist alongside our most devastating failures, and that the difference between a thriving community and a dying one can be as simple as where you dig your well and where you dump your waste knowledge that seems obvious now but cost countless lives to learn.